and welcome to another edition of the Leadership Lenses podcast, a 15-minute podcast designed for busy leaders, heads of school, principals, and anyone else who is interested and dedicated to improving education and Jewish education wherever they may be. This week, we have a really wonderful guest with us, and I'm really, really excited for this. For those of you watching on the video, I'm going to hold up the book, which I have what do you call that? I vet the corners, I put in Post-it notes, and this is the third edition. So I've had all three, and they've really informed my practice as a leader. So I'm really excited to have Kim Marshall here. Kim, in addition to really pioneering one of the only real effective, pragmatic approaches to teacher supervision from a principal's perspective, is also just, I found, to be a generous individual, happy to give of his time, happy to support and help others, and really represents all the best of what we hope from educational leadership and educational research. So thank you, Kim, for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Amazing. So can I ask you, just for those who may not have it, I'm guessing a good portion of the audience has read, heard, seen you before, but for those who haven't, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this focus area of researching how principals supervise teachers and trying to shape an approach to that?
So as a teacher in Boston in the 1970s, I was evaluated by an officious individual who came from the central office and was very concerned about the shades in my room all being at the same height, and the chalkboard, remember chalkboards being dust-free, and of course discipline and so forth. And he was very skeptical of me as a young beginning teacher, and I was terrified for my job. But once I got my act together, which sort of happened between my first and my second year, they pretty much left me alone. So I experienced the extremes of, a fearful, officious, nitpicky kind of teacher evaluation to, once I, had reasonable classroom management control and an interesting curriculum system going. Occasionally there will be visitors, but I don't really recall a lot of people coming in and taking a lot of detailed notes. So I experienced both ends of it as a teacher. So I was a teacher for 9 years. And then I went back to grad school, got certified as a principal, became a principal after a little hiatus in the central office, and started using the traditional system that I've been trained in by John Safier, one of the great experts at this. And we would go in, take detailed notes, do a brief, detailed write-up, and then sit with the teacher going over it afterward. And really did that and worked hard at that for years, for about 6 years as an elementary school principal in Boston. And then teachers sort of pulled me aside and said, well, Kim, we don't really read these long reports because, we were there. We know what happened during the school. So your very accurate descriptions are nice, but, not informative because we were there. And we're just interested in our grade. And also, it doesn't really seem like you care very much about us or as if you appreciate what we're doing. Because I was into this sort of low inference note, trying to give a description of what was going on, kind of a court stenographer approach. And so I was really dumbfounded by that and a little bit hurt because I'd been working so hard for so many years at doing these long teacher evaluations, often at the last minute, by the way, just before Boston's deadline in May. And so this was really a turning point. And I began with teachers' encouragement to make more frequent visits and to keep them less formal. In fact, not taking notes at all. And then talking to the teacher individually afterward and sort of having kind of a feedback coaching type of conversation. And I dubbed this mini observations. And it was sort of a hit from the very beginning. The union folks in the building were a little wary, but as soon as they became apparent that this was very low stakes, there was no scoring. It was sort of a much more of a dialogue about teaching and learning. They liked it too. And I did actually many observations for 9 years for the whole rest of my 15-year principal's tenure. And I wrote an article about it, wrote a book about it, a second edition of the book, now Barry held up the third edition, which is great. A lot of improvements and changing. And really the basic, the idea has remained the same, short, frequent, unannounced visits, face-to-face coaching. But I really understood how it's not just a slam dunk. There's a lot to this. The devil's in the details. And so that's really what I've been working on since I left the principalship in 2002, did a lot of coaching of principals And then I started a year in doing this thing called the Marshall Memo, which is a summary of good ideas and research from multiple publications, which I do every week. And of course, in that, I've been watching the issue of teacher supervision very carefully because I have strong interest in it, have developed a methodology for doing that that's a little different. And to my amazement, the research on teacher evaluation is really kind of unimpressive. Most researchers sort of accept the traditional model: full lesson observation, big write-up, pre-observation, post-observation conference. And so I've been pretty discouraged at what I've seen, but occasionally there are little glimmerings of people who have sort of stumbled upon it. It turns out there are like 7 books about this that have been written, but no very formal research. So we don't have kind of a real comparison of mini observations versus traditional. And then there's this whole thing in the United States of trying to use test scores and other sort of so-called objective data to evaluate teachers. So we can talk about that if you want, but that's sort of a blind alley.
Sure. So actually, I want to go in a slightly different direction because almost all our listeners, I'm guessing, work in a non-public school. So most of them are in private Jewish day schools, yeshivas, or other independent schools in the US and Canada. And so I'm curious, if you don't have all the regulations of the public school, I would say the vast majority don't have teacher unions. Some do, but if they do, there's an agreement between the individual school and the union, typically not between any government body or broad district. So what would you imagine principals could do in that setting that maybe they couldn't do or would have more challenge doing in a regulated public school setting?
Well, theoretically, they can do anything they want, but in practice,
which is the problem sometimes, right, because that gives them very little direction.
Right. So that's the theory, but in practice, even though teachers don't have a union, they act like they have a union. And school leaders still need to be respectful of teachers. They don't want them storming out in protest. They don't want lawsuits. They don't want arbitration. They don't want unhappy teachers. And so in general, people, whatever kind of school it is, treat teachers with respect. And they try to devise a system that is helpful to teaching and learning. And of course, you've got parents paying a lot for tuition and so forth. And so you want to keep them happy, which is true in public school as well. Parents pay taxes. So I found that most private schools, I work in independent schools, Jewish day schools, Catholic schools a lot, are pretty much using the traditional system. And that is partly because they don't have a lot of encouragement to change. And from the teacher's point of view, it's a lot safer to know when the administrator's coming, to be able to have the pre-observation conference, have a heads up, and then put on, what is often known as the glamorized lesson or the dog and pony show for the administrator when he or she comes in. So I'm kind of shocked that even given the freedom of people in independent and private schools, a lot of people do not take advantage of it to create a better system that develops more trust and that actually improves teaching and learning more. Some people do informally, and I've coached them and I've worked with them and I've helped them. And I definitely have done some work in those kind of schools, but then they still get teacher resistance because the immediate reaction to many observations is, wait a minute. What can you see in 10 minutes? That's ridiculous. Or you don't know my subject area. You don't know kindergarten, or you don't know calculus, or you're out to get me. This is a gotcha. There's a lot of pushback on the idea of short, frequent, unannounced visits. And you can persuade people, but you have to persuade people. and often, I show a video or something. But back to your point, I think that a lot of private school educators are not taking advantage of the freedom that they have. And I think the result is that a lot of mediocre and ineffective teaching practices are flying under the radar because they're not in classrooms enough.
Yeah. So I want to try and get into 2 parts of that you noted. One is, why aren't they taking advantage of it? And the other is, okay, well, how do you change the mediocre teaching practices? So just on the first one, you talked about resistance from teachers. There seems to also be resistance from principals who also don't want to let go of that tried and true 3 clinical observation cycles per year, and I know I've done my job sort of method.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a little more perhaps demanding at the outset to go in and make a short visit and to use your knowledge of pedagogy and so forth, even if you don't know the specific subject area, to be able to have a feedback conversation. And the article that I'm actually about to publish now, it's coming out next month in Edutopia, is an article about the tendency of principals to send written notes by email or by text, or in a checklist to the teacher, avoiding the conversation. And I think there's a lot of avoidance here. So principals are not stupid. They kind of know what's going on around their building. They walk around just by glancing in a classroom window. You can get a little snapshot of the dynamic. All the kids are sitting quietly, taking notes, or the teacher is sitting behind their desk, reading the New York Times, or whatever is going on, or there's a lot of noise, or there's a lot of good noise. And so you have an intuitive sense, and you hear from parents and you hear from kids. So you have that sense. And many principals walk around their building every day, every classroom every day, just to smile and wave, kind of, good morning, boys and girls kind of thing, which is nice. But if you put two polar opposites, there's that, the walking around kind of, quick glimpse, and the comment from a parent or something. And then at the other extreme, the formal sit down, take detailed notes and give a detailed write-up. And both of those are really quite ineffective at the second part of your question, which is coaching. How do you coach? So let's take a classic example of a mediocre practice. Teachers, has the attention of the kids. Classroom management is okay. Teacher asks a good question. What does it take for a leader to change history? And right away, 2 or 3 kids raise their hands, and the teacher calls in those kids, and they are the quote smart kids, the fast responders, the eager beavers, the want to please the teacher, the well informed, chose their parents well kind of kids. And so they answer, and the 3 of them, the teacher and these couple of kids, have a lively discussion. And to a superficial observer, looks like good teaching, good question. Kids are involved. Other kids seem to be, nodding their heads and listening. Maybe they're taking notes. But that's a classic mediocre practice, right? It's only involving directly a couple of kids, cognitively involving, and the rest of them are kind of passive. And if they've got their cell phones, under their desk, they may be checking out their texting or their Facebook page or something, or their TikTok video. And by the way, that's a whole other thing we could get into with cell phones. So this is a mediocre practice. Now, how do you change that teacher? Well, if during the formal observation, they might not do that. During the formal, they might actually do a better check for understanding, because they know that that's on the principal's mind, right? That, you want to involve more kids. But by more frequent visits, you see this in practice. And then if you're halfway decent principal, and I think most principals, know that that's a mediocre practice, then you go to work. You say, so Barry, a great question, about history changing people. I noticed only a couple of kids were talking. What are some ways that we can get more kids more actively involved? Have you tried poll everywhere? Have you tried, kids signaling to questions on their chest? Have you tried, Kahoot? Have you tried, Plickers? There are different ways. And actually, Sarah down the hall, she's really using that effectively. Why don't I cover your class tomorrow, third period? And you can go down and watch Sarah use poll everywhere, because it's kind of cool. And so you're giving a little prod, and you're giving some ideas. And that way, again, if you're around frequently, and what I'm recommending is at least once a month, doing one of these mini observations, you see reality, you see what the kids are really getting, and then you begin to change practice gradually. And of course, you do PD if you're noticing a pattern around the building. Okay, well, formative assessment seems to be a deficit around the school. And by the way, that's one of my big issues, is formative assessment is effective. The worst way to check for understanding is, any questions?
Yes. Raise your hand if you don't understand. Is right. Yeah, raise your hand if you're absent. That's
everyone with me? Yep. Does that make sense?
So I imagine these conversations you're talking about happen, somewhere private afterwards. I know that's something you've mentioned always. And I think the thread that goes through all of your work is the respect for teachers, which is crucial. Based on my coaching, my sense is that a lot of principals don't do this work in this way because they're afraid of having that conversation. They're afraid of the sense of conflict, or they're afraid that they won't have enough to give and enough to guide. So how do you coach principals who have that kind of resistance?
Well, I do a lot of this work in person, totally before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic online, and now a mixture. One of my principals that I'm coaching is in Mumbai in India. One is in South Africa, but mostly around the United States. And whenever I can do it in person, and what I do is to co-observe. Like, we go in and we watch a couple of classes. And then, in fact, you referred me to a Jewish day school outside of Houston, where I, spent a whole day doing a series of co-observations with the 4 principals and coming back to the office after watching a couple of classes and debriefing. And I find that most principals are not cowards. They're not they're not clueless. I mean, they have opinions. They go in and they see stuff. And then the interesting conversation was how would you structure this conversation? And that's one of my big new ideas in the 3rd edition of the book is the way the conversation goes. And again, I don't think this is rocket science, but having a structure really helps. So the first thing is to give a compliment, unless it was a total meltdown or the teacher was incredibly mean and sarcastic or whatever, there's something you can compliment. So, particularly effective use of your whiteboard and, so whatever. And then get the teacher talking. And so this avoids the traditional feedback sandwich, first the compliment, then the criticism, then the compliment. And people hate that. And they can see it coming, oh boy, here comes the criticism, And so, but my second is think of a quadrant, with four parts. The first one is compliment. The second one is get the teacher talking. And it's not hard to do this because most teachers, unless they're super burned out, are kind of into their work and they care about the kids, they care about their subject. And so an open-ended question like, tell me what happened after I left. I was only in there for 10 minutes. Or I noticed that girl got so excited. What was up with that? I didn't quite understand why she was so excited about that question. Or tell me what you hoped I would notice, because I know you've been working on so-and-so, or, I know one of your goals for this year is more hands-on, turn and talk type of stuff. And, tell me how that's going. So, and teachers will usually start talking and might be difficult to stop them talking because they have a lot to say about things. But when you're talking about this window that you were in their classroom, this 10 or 15 minute window, by the way, that's the sweet spot in terms of the amount of time for a mini observation. And now you're inviting the teacher, give me the broader context. What happened after what happened before I came in? How does this fit in to the curriculum? What's the level of student, investment in this thing about the Holocaust or whatever it is you're teaching? And teachers will talk, and then the principal is sort of watching for the opening. Now, when you were in for the mini observation, you might have said, "Aha, I got to talk about that. That's my point." Because you're focusing on one thing at a time, right? The whole thing with frequent mini observations is, just like a good athletic coach, one thing at a time, working on your dribbling. But as the teacher talks, you might change your mind. You might see the teachers particularly interested or open, or maybe even asking for feedback on a particular thing. So then part 3 is your leverage point. And there doesn't have to be one, it can be 100% compliments if it's a wonderful lesson, but usually there's something to talk about. And so, based on what the teacher said and what you saw in the classroom, now you're going to give a coaching point, a leverage point. What's the best way to make this teaching a little bit better or a lot better? And then the last part is consolidating, in an actionable next step. So you're going to try Plickers, you're intrigued with that. And so, I'm really interested in seeing how that goes and talking to you about it, maybe as I walk around or maybe the next time I do a mini observation. And then the lovely way to end the conversation is, so what's your big takeaway? Barry, we talked about this, what do you think? What's your takeaway? And so that structure, compliment, get the teacher talking, leverage point, consolidation, I don't think is rocket science, but it takes a little practice, and most people can do this. Now, you talked about avoidance, and there's always avoidance. But again, by making it, short, frequent, and low stakes, we're not giving you a grade, we're not giving you a rubric score, we're just talking about your teaching and possible ways to improve. And also, ideally in the teacher's classroom when the kids aren't there. See, that's the ideal place. When there aren't kids and not in my office, where you're a little bit, the principal's office or the head of school's office, whatever, keeping it relatively sort of perching on a desk. And of course, the lots of advantages to being in the teacher's classroom. You can look at the student work. You can look at what's up on the walls. You can look at this anchor chart. You can look at desk arrangement. You can look at sight lines, all kinds of stuff when you're in there. And it's also a good memory jog for the principal. So not rocket science, not super hard, but often it takes a little bit of a prod to get people into this rhythm.
Yeah. So you asked what my key takeaway is. So first, I just want to note that among the elements of Kim's generosity is a couple of websites that have tremendous resources. I'm going to link those both in the show notes so that you can access them. And one of the resources, correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, but I think one of the resources is actually a diagram of the 4 steps and how one can go about using that as a visual reminder to guide their feedback conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if that's not up, I can send you a screenshot of that. Yeah.
Amazing. So we'll look for that, and we'll make sure we connect you with that also. My key takeaway, though, is that you're using words like I'm intrigued, I'm interested, I'm fascinated from the principal's perspective. And so it's clear to me that the question you're asking the teacher is not something along the lines of, hey, you lectured for 10 minutes. Why did you think that was a good form of teaching? Right? Which I think, unfortunately, is where a lot of people go because they imitate unwittingly the way they were supervised. Right. And then the teacher thinks it's a game of gotcha. Their guard goes up. Everybody's got a problem. And the principal imagines, well, I've got to be an expert because I've got to be smarter than the teacher to tell them what they're doing wrong. And what you're describing sounds much more like I've got to be a curious coach. So it doesn't matter if I know more or less than the teacher. My advantage is that I'm not the teacher. So I'm seeing and I'm asking a lot of good questions and generating this learning. The conversation with Kim went on well beyond our regular 15-minute deadline. We wanted to share all of his insights with you, but we also want to respect your time. So we're going to pause the episode here. Leave you to think a little bit about the idea of curiosity as part of leadership, instructional leadership, and teaching. And next week, Kim will pick up on that, as well as some fascinating points which he has not yet included in any of his published works. Reminder to check the show notes for Kim's website, Marshall Memo, and the best of the Marshall Memo, an amazing free website with a ton of great resources for you. If you want to contact us, LinkedIn, Barry Kislowitz, Leadership Lenses, Substack, or www.kislowitzconsulting.com. See you next week. Happy leading.